What if everything we've been told about autoimmunity is wrong? I'm Elizabeth Yarnell. After awakening partially blind one morning in 1999, a doctor told me my multiple sclerosis would put me in a wheelchair within 10 years. I refused to accept that as the end of the story, so I started investigating. Welcome to the Inflammation Investigator, the podcast that uncovers the inflammation lurking underneath your ailments. Because autoimmune and chronic conditions should not be viewed as death knells when they are actually alarm bells. I'm a traditional naturopath and founder of the Inflammation Academy. And in 2 episodes every week, we dig into what conventional medicine might be missing. If you're living with chronic or unexplained symptoms, this investigation is for you. Your body has been trying to tell you something. Let's start listening. Hey, welcome back to the Inflammation Investigator. Today we're going to talk about something you may or may not know anything about. We're going to talk about ayahuasca. We're going to talk about plant medicine from the jungles. We're going to talk about how it all fits back and relates to inflammation and how it can be really helpful. So let me introduce you to today's guest. This is Dr. Heather Paulson. She is a retired naturopathic physician and the co-founder of Hampoi House, a plant medicine retreat center in the Sacred Valley of Peru. For almost 2 decades, she worked in integrative oncology, helping patients navigate the intersection of conventional and natural medicine, with a particular focus on the inflammatory drivers beneath chronic illness. Her work at Hampoi House grew from a question she kept returning to: what happens when the nervous system finally feels safe? She has witnessed how ceremony, somatic integration, and traditional Andean and Amazonian plant medicines create conditions where the body's own healing intelligence can do what no protocol could. Her perspective bridges clinical precision and ceremonial wisdom, and she brings both to conversations about inflammation, trauma, and the conditions that allow genuine healing to begin. She lives in the Sacred Valley of Peru. Heather, Dr. Heather, I should say, welcome to the Inflammation Investigator.
Thank you so much for having me. You can call me just Heather. It's all good.
Excellent. Well, this is so exciting for me because this is a topic I have been very interested in for at least a decade. I have never been able to try it myself, but I feel like it's one of my bucket list things to do. And maybe I'll even come down and visit you in Peru someday. But let's start with, how did you get to the Sacred Valley of Peru? That's not someplace you were born into.
Right. Yes, I am not Peruvian, although I hope that they adopt me as a true Peruvian. I got to the Sacred Valley really in search of questions I had about how to support my patients healing better. As you shared in my intro, I did integrative oncology, and I was always looking at the cause beneath the cause. In integrative oncology, we're really good at looking at different inflammatory markers that create an environment that tumor cells can grow in, like interleukin 6 and COX2, a C-reactive protein, some things that you also look at for other inflammatory health conditions. But there was something missing that labs can't describe, right? There's this other piece underneath the biology of inflammation or cancer or autoimmunity that, yeah, you just can't measure it in labs, right? So that's what started out my quest. And in oncology, I was really curious about the connection between trauma, inflammation, and cancer cell growth. And I tried all the other things to support my patients in resolving these these things that actually add to our inflammatory response. And what I started leaning into was first with psychotherapy, then with some trauma-informed care, but then some research studies started coming about regarding psilocybin for stage 4 cancer patients. And I started intellectually becoming fascinated with the use of psychedelics for resolving long-term chronic health conditions and really looking at it through the lens of reducing risk of cancer recurrence. So I started reading research studies, and that is the very first grain, like breadcrumb that led me to Peru.
Wow. Okay, so when did you get to Peru? We'll just start there.
Yeah, I moved to Peru in 2021. So that at the end of 2021. So I've been here for almost 5 years now. And I got here by invitation through a Peruvian ayahuasquero that was doing plant medicine dietas here, including other non-psychedelic master plants, and then also traveling around the world serving ayahuasca. And that was my first introduction to Peru, was coming here with an ayahuasquero, really curious from a medical perspective about how these other plants from the jungle could help people heal. And probably I was uh, influenced by, I think, a Sean Connery movie where he finds the cure to cancer in the Amazon jungle. I don't know if anyone else remembers that
Oh,
movie. I think
wait,
it's
that
called
sounds familiar.
Medicine Man or something. I saw it when I was pretty young. And I was like, there's such a pharmacy here in the jungle. And so, out of curiosity, I took a sabbatical from my clinic and packed up my bags and wound up in Peru.
Wow. Okay. So ayahuasca is maybe just the most famous of these medicines right now, at least in our culture, which is not in Peru. But there are other ones. What other plants do you work with and have you been studying down in Peru and in the Amazon?
Yeah, so there are so many plants here. I mean, hundreds of plants in the jungle, probably even thousands. I don't know if we've even categorized them all. And one of the things from a Western medical perspective that's really challenging is that a lot of these plants are not well classified. They're not published in PubMed. They have different names in different regions of the jungle. So in one part you're calling it this, and another part you're calling it that. So um, it's been interesting from my Western medical herbalism perspective to kind of wrap my head around some of these plants. But some of them are very familiar, probably to you and to everyone listening. One of the plants that we diet here is una de gato or cat's claw. And cat's claw is used very commonly in Western herbalism, or you can get it at Whole Foods or Sprouts or any natural food store, Amazon, whatever, wherever you get your supplements. And that was one of the first plants that I dieted. We also work a lot when we're talking about inflammation, rheumatism. We work a lot with a plant that's used outside of dieta as well called chuchuasa. And that's a very common plant here in Peru for rheumatism, for joint pain. And it's great for bringing down antibodies. And then we also work with Bobinsana, which is mostly known for its capacity for increasing lucid dreaming. But because I'm a research nerd and I love digging into these plants and seeing what I can uncover in PubMed, I found that it's also great at reducing COX-2 expression, which is a common drug pathway for inflammation and autoimmunity that we target.
So there's a whole pharmacy of anti-inflammatory plants in the Amazonian jungle. I feel like the more I dig into what's growing naturally on this earth, the more it is just painful to see all the deforestation that's happening in the jungle. Is it Colombia that just declared their entire Amazon to be off limits to any type of extraction?
Yeah, so and same here in Peru, they have claimed the Amazon as a living being. So it has the same human rights as any person, the same protection measures. Yeah, and that's happening in Colombia, in Brazil, in Peru, in Ecuador. It's really a huge movement right now in South America.
Thank goodness, because we know that the Amazon jungle are supplies like basically the lungs, right, to the earth because of all the trees and all the carbon it sequesters and transforms. But I think we talk less about the multitude of chemicals and plants that are in there that can really heal the things that are ailing our world, our people, the people in our world, I should say, not just the planet. So I'm so excited to talk more about these and to learn that you are using them on a regular basis. So, how does your retreat center work for this?
Well, the way that it works, if people want to use and work with, and I call these master plants our collaborators. So if people want to collaborate with a master plant, because it's really about not just taking a supplement mindlessly or holding your nose while drinking a tincture. It's about building a relationship with these plants. And that is how it's approached here in the jungle tribes that have been caretakers of these plants and using them medicinally for their community members for centuries. So it's a little different than having that line of supplements on your counter and
Uh-huh.
being like, okay, fish oil, shoving them in your mouth and taking them without connecting with them. And when you work with these particular plants, they're known as master plants because they have other information to teach us. And they can unwind other parts of our dis-ease that is not just biochemical. We're not taking Bobinsana just for reducing COX-2. We're actually learning from the plant about opening our heart and what pieces of ourselves have been blocked off. And as you know, that sense of blocking off certain pieces of ourselves or um, certain experiences in our life, this leads to autoimmunity in a lot of women. We have research data that backs that up, that can trace this back in trauma history or even just self repression. There's data on how that impacts the expression of autoimmunity and inflammation. So these plants teach us about those parts of ourselves so that we can integrate all of the pieces and parts of ourselves and become a whole person again.
So, can you share with me any, and our listeners, any stories of people who have come to your center and what their experiences have been?
Yeah, absolutely. That was a very roundabout way to answer what happens here. Like logistically speaking, we usually work with these plants in a 10-day to 30-day container, depending on the health condition that someone's coming here with. And you drink a liter of the tea. So it's a hot brew extract of the bark or the leaves or the roots of these different plants. And this also comes with a special diet. So there's no garlic, no alcohol, no red meat, no pork. A very plain diet of mostly plain rice and plantains, sometimes some fish, sometimes some chicken, and then lots of vegetables. So it's a intentionally clean diet without any spices or additives so that you can connect with the plants better. So that's a little bit more about that. Sorry to sidestep that question.
No, that's very interesting. So no garlic. That's an interesting take. Is
Yeah, well, we know that for some people with rheumatism, like rheumatoid arthritis, can actually be super sensitive to garlic, peppers, onions, right? That's part of a common allergy elimination diet when someone's been diagnosed with autoimmune conditions or rheumatism or inflammation. It's part of the anti-inflammatory diet as well. So for me, it was very curious that I knew all of these kinds of therapeutic diets from my Western mind and seeing it in its own way replicated in the jungle. And the way that people eat during a dieta also mimics intermittent fasting or a fasting mimicking diet that Walter Longo did with cancer patients. The calories, the fat, the macros of a dieta very much match the macros of a fasting mimicking diet.
so you're saying the ancestral indigenous uh, traditions are actually the same as what our scientific minds are doing now.
Yeah, but even better in some ways because we're also dieting electronics, Wi-Fi, EMFs, artificial light, all of these
Uh-huh.
other things that influence our modern world and have been tied to melatonin production decreasing and guess what, melatonin's an anti-inflammatory, right? So it's also living more in alignment with your regular rhythms, your circadian rhythms, and then for those of us who are EMF sensitive, and maybe that's part of our inflammatory process, being in the jungle, there there is no Wi-Fi. There is no cell reception where we go to in the jungle. Here at my house, people do dietas at our house in the Sacred Valley as well. And here we do have Wi-Fi and hot showers and things like that. But it's still, we're in nature in Peru. There's not 5G here yet. There's just less electronic noise in general.
Okay, so I think I interrupted you about telling us about some client stories.
Yes, yes. Sorry about that. Well, yeah, so one of the most impactful stories that led me down this path was somebody that I met in my first couple of months of working with ayahuasca who had Lyme's disease. And she was doing all the right integrative protocols for Lyme's. She was doing, cycling antibiotics, doing all the functional medicine IVs, taking all the supplements and herbs and all of the things. And she had Lyme's disease for approximately 5 years when I first met her. And I was working with her really closely because she was very, very nervous about giving up her supplements and trusting the process. And I was like guiding her how to step off, supplement by supplement, working with her naturopathic doctor in Colorado. And I was really blown away because as someone who practiced integrative oncology, I'm naturally skeptical of miracle cures. There's so many claims about miracle cures in the oncology world. And so I wasn't making any claims that this was going to cure her Lyme's disease or anything, but I was like, okay, but we need you off these supplements to so that ayahuasca can do its work because in the jungle they say ayahuasca is a jealous plant and doesn't like it when you're working with other plants at the same time. My assumption is that there's probably some innate wisdom about herb interactions there that they're describing as jealousy. But anyways, she needed to get off her supplements. And so she came for 3 nights of ayahuasca and she did one Kambo ceremony which is a frog peptide that's collected from the frog skin. I call it the original peptide therapy because they've been doing this peptide therapy in the jungle for centuries. And this peptide and ayahuasca are both known to bring down autoimmune markers and help balance the T helper cell reaction, which is commonly found in autoimmune conditions, but also reducing inflammation in general. And also, ayahuasca is very well known for being anti-parasitic, antimicrobial, antiviral. And so it has these properties working as well. And when she got done with the 3 days, the first night she was in quite a bit of pain and quite a bit of nerve pain, which is a common presentation for Lyme's. And what the research finds is that ayahuasca actually re-stimulates nerve growth, even in the peripheral nerves. So it's not just working in the brain, it's working in our entire body. And so she was having quite a bit of pain the first night. Sometimes that happens when we're working through neuropathy and having no feeling and getting those nerves to wake back up. I saw that a lot with chemo side effects from chemotherapy, but when the nerves come back online, it can be a little sensitive. And then by the end of the third night, she was out of pain. And I was like, okay, well, that's cool. It probably isn't going to last. I mean, you don't cure Lyme's disease in 3 nights. That's unheard of. And she's been doing all these other things for years. And she went back to a month later, she went back to her MD that was supporting her with her Lyme's, and they redid her markers. And there was no longer any residual infections, not even secondary infections. Her C-reactive protein was normal for the first time in years, and she wasn't in pain, and she wasn't tired, and she felt great. And even her cortisol normalized. And there's research studies on ayahuasca normalizing cortisol levels if they're too high or too low. So I was blown away by that. And I loved having that instance where I had the numbers in front of me. I could stare at it and be like, wait, what? Let me look at your old labs and your new labs. And I even checked in with her like 6 months later, a year later, and she was still pain-free, infection-free, and didn't have to go back on all of the things that she was doing previously. So when that happened, I was like, I really, wait, what's happening here? And I really have to pay attention. But since then, there's been a lot of people that we've worked with that have come with chronic pain that have dieted different plants and left here pain-free. And it it surprises me every time because, like I said, I'm naturally a skeptic. But now I'm starting to learn how to lean into like that's actually reality. Like that's more frequent than not. So that's, I have a lot more stories, but I'll pause here.
It's so surprising for me to hear that because the people I have spoken with who have partaken of ayahuasca have had very intense consciousness experiences where some of them have felt like that they have spoken to their dead relatives. For example, one man whose daughter committed suicide, he felt like he connected with her during this ayahuasca ceremony. I've never heard that there have anybody talk about a physical transformation in terms of being in pain before and then not being in pain after the ceremony. So I I just have to say, wow, that is amazing. What can you give us a story about anybody who used one of the other plants who maybe had a transformation?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I want to let you know that it's actually very common that people don't think of ayahuasca for physical healing in the Western world. And we have really reduced its value to just being about the spiritual connections and or just about the psychedelic experience and the visuals and things like that. And it's one of my missions in this work to expand people's horizons when it comes to ayahuasca. Yes, absolutely. You'll have visions. You can connect with past loved ones. You can resolve past traumas that are all part of why we store things in the body and why we have inflammatory markers. We do we do ceremony in a community. And there's all these studies about community and connecting in a community and how that reduces inflammatory markers. And when we're isolated and on our own without community, that increases inflammatory markers. So there are many aspects to ayahuasca, but I like focusing on some of these physical healing opportunities because it's like over our heads in Western medicine. And when we talk about psychedelics in the framework of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy and in America, in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, we're missing out on this whole other piece of physical healing that can happen. So, anyways, that's one of my soapboxes here. Thank you for noticing.
No, I think it's fascinating. So you mentioned Bobinsana. How
Yeah.
does that one work?
So, Bobinsana is a fascinating plant that is known as the Sirenita de los Ríos, the mermaid of the rivers in the Amazon, because the plant grows over the river. And when the river goes up and down, it looks like a mermaid's tail swimming in the
Ah,
river. So, from a law of signatures perspective, which is one of the tenets of old time Western herbalism, it works with the waters of our body. And waters of our body are also known to be the emotions of our body. And it is known as a heart opener. But what I always tell people about heart openers is that in order to expand your heart, you first have to unwrap all the things that are keeping it constricted. And so that could be a process because a lot of times people are like, oh, heart opener, that must be like so beautiful and so lovely. And it is. And also, you're going to have to look at some of the things that made you shut down a little bit, made you wall off a little bit, past hurts, past griefs. We've had people come here really in the grieving process of losing a loved one. Someone came here losing the love of her life. Someone else came here after she lost her soul dog, and we're really like working through the grief of that loss. But on a physical side, so that's the like mental, emotional, spiritual side of things. On a physical side, using Bobinsana as a COX-2 inhibitor, I have used it in these situations where people are in pain and have a cross section of inflammatory pain and emotional trauma or inflammatory pain and wanting to connect with the heart more. So, what I do before someone works with a master plant is an interview to hear where these cross sections are, what is going on in their physical body, what is going in their emotional, mental, and spiritual body. And in the case of the woman who lost the love of her life in a traumatic shooting, and literally held him while he died in her arms, she was having like little inflammatory pains and the kind of weight gain that's associated with inflammation, the kind of sleep patterns that is affiliated with trauma, but also some maladaptive melatonin and cortisol rhythms. And through Bobinsana, she was able to release some of that pain, release some of that weight, and also start sleeping normally again for the first time in years. and really made peace on a spiritual level with the shooter. And she had to go back to the US to face that shooter in his last trial, for the sentencing of him. And she was able to do that and take the action she needed legally, but hold a sense of forgiveness and a sense of peace really in her heart for everything that had happened. And I can only imagine, we don't have as great a story with her about lab work, but I can only imagine that coming to a space of peace around a very traumatic event in her life will prevent disease and prevent these inflammatory cascades from further expressing themselves in the future.
Let's talk a little bit about the research behind trauma and how it connects to long-term disease formation. How has that how has that been apparent in your own work?
The way that it showed up in my oncology work was looking at adverse childhood events and the risk of cancer cells expressing themselves in the body. And this was a piece that, especially after people came to me and they were actively going through treatment and their tumors resolved, I felt like this was a piece of risk of recurrence that wasn't really being talked about.
Mm,
But we know from studies about adverse childhood events that chronic inflammation is frequently a downstream effect of unresolved trauma. And so this is where we can do all of the right diet and supplements and still feel like we're going uphill a little bit in our healing process. And it's not until we resolve some like I said with this woman, come to a space of equanimity or peace with past events, or at least bringing past events into the light, that we'll stop walking uphill with all of our other strategies for reducing inflammation. So I think it's really under talked about and underutilized, right? It's like so much easier to take a high dose of fish oil. Really, it is. And I totally get that. But the data is there and really, really fascinating. So like for this is from an ACEs study that childhood maltreatment was associated with elevated C-reactive protein 20 years later in adulthood. So can be across lifetimes. And then there's also some other epigenetic information too about some of the epigenetic expression of inflammation that could be passed down uh, through ancestral trauma, familial trauma. So you might not have been in a traumatic event, but there's this epigenetic marker that your great grandfather was part of a traumatic event, and this epigenetic marker got passed down to you, so you're predisposed to inflammation. And this is also something that is not addressed. We don't really talk about ancestral trauma being the source of inflammation. At least I didn't used to talk about that when it came to a lot of my oncology patients. And it's a tool that we can all tap into when we're doing all the right things and our inflammation still isn't budging.
I read something about a study, I want to say it was about a famine in the Netherlands.
Hmm.
That have you heard about this? Um,
Yes.
yes, that has been tracked to intergenerational trauma and inflammation and disease generations after, maybe two generations after this famine, maybe three generations. I can't remember exactly when it was. I feel a little embarrassed that my memory is a little foggy on it, but
Yeah, I mean, it falls into epigenetics falls into a traditional Native American perspective, a tribal perspective on how things go forward 7 generations and back generations. So you're always acting in the moment now for the next 7 generations. And actually, that is exactly what epigenetics shows, that it is translated for 7 to 10 generations, these epigenomes that get turned on from famine, from war, from traumatic events, which is really fascinating. Again, I love it when we can say, oh, wow, traditional knowledge is right. Like, oh, we can trust in this traditional knowledge. It's being supported by science.
And epigenetics is a very relatively recent study. Can you explain to people who are listening who might not be familiar with the term epigenetics? What does it mean?
I will do my best because it gets into like all these terms like methylation, blah, blah. So let me do my best to explain epigenetics. It essentially, we have on off switches for DNA replication. And on top of these on off switches is the epigenome that can make, while the manufacturing process a a DNA strand is happening, it can more or less make you skip certain stages or overproduce certain stages or just yeah, just completely delete things. And the way this shows up is that this shows up a lot in oncology and environment and in environmental oncology. So people who have cancer due to environmental exposures to plastics or glyphosates or whatever it might be. Um, so in those situations, usually it's saying it's telling the factory to make more genes than is necessary. In inflammation, it's telling the factory to make and be hypersensitive to something. So this could be expressed in a histamine reaction that's leading to inflammation, or this can be expressed just in having more COX-2 receptors and more COX-2 factories making more inflammatory markers. It's a really hard concept to simply define. How did I do?
I think you did really well. I tend to think of it like you may have the BRCA gene that says that the BRCA gene is breast cancer. And it's a little trendy these days if you have the BRCA gene just to get a double mastectomy prophylactically, which is not fun for anybody to do and maybe unnecessary because epigenetics says that you can influence whether that BRCA gene expresses as cancer or doesn't express as cancer by your lifestyle and how you how you live on a day-to-day basis. What do you think of
Yes,
that?
exactly. Yeah, that's a great addition because, yes, the epigenome is influenceable. So, how it expresses itself is influenceable, like you brought up with the BRCA gene. There are studies showing that if those women take methylfolate and also eat a high vegetable diet and a Mediterranean leaning diet, that they're less likely to even express the BRCA gene. So, yes, it is influenceable. This like turning things on and off, the switches are influenceable. And I think that's where in functional medicine, a lot of looking at methylation factors, looking at your genome, in oncology, we would look at that quite a bit. That is part of why you start taking EGCG or fish oil or methylfolate.
Right, right. You support your genes through targeted nutrients, things like that.
Hmm.
Let's talk about the safety of plant medicine. I know that there's a lot of fear, at least here in the United States, about this kind of um, tourism that goes to South America and partakes of these plant medicine ceremonies without the any type of familiar guardrails. So, what do you guys do at your center to ensure the safety and the purity of the plant medicine?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And it's really why I started Hampoi House. Didn't start it because I was like, oh, I'm an ayahuasca expert and I should open a center. I started it because I saw these gaps in safety happening. And what's happening a lot in traditional ayahuasca centers is that people will just blindly say, get off of all your medications, right? And I saw in a retreat that I was in, uh, someone go into a thyroid crisis because
Oh,
the shaman was telling everyone to, with a blanket statement, to get off of all their medications, and she had her thyroid surgically removed, and I was like, you should not be off of your medications. Like, please start your thyroid medicine as soon as possible. You packed it, right? It's in your suitcase, right? Like, um, so I saw things like this happening, and it's because look, these are traditional healers and they have amazing knowledge and they have so much wisdom that can be passed on. And they're not trained in drug interactions, drug herb interactions, these sorts of things. And actually, there's no evidence that a thyroid medication would negatively interact with ayahuasca. But because they're scared of what might happen, they just tell people to get off of all their medications. So, what we do here, because of my background and because in integrative oncology, I was constantly looking at drug interactions with supplements, with herbs. I have a good baseline of doing research and doing a little extra digging and saying, do you have to get off of that medication? Actually, recently I had someone ask me, I'm on a GLP-1, can I come and do ayahuasca? And I was like, I don't know. Let me check the data. And what I found was that ayahuasca actually has its own GLP-1 effect and can help people overcome a GLP-1 plateau when they're on a GLP-1 and can be synergistic with GLP-1s. I was like, yeah, come on, come on over. But somebody who is traditionally trained in ayahuasca and doesn't have the medical background wouldn't go to PubMed, wouldn't look that up and would just say, no, no, get off of it. And I'm like, no, let's do some synergism here. If you're going to take the medication, let's make it work better if we can. Now, there are other times where medications are strictly contraindicated, like SSRIs are strictly contraindicated with ayahuasca because there's a risk of serotonin syndrome. So there are times where you absolutely do have to be off of your medications in order to collaborate with ayahuasca. And that's part of our process is screening the medications that you're on, your past medical history, even if you're not on any medications now, the supplements that you're on, because there are some supplements like St. John's wort that fit in that kind of SSRI category and could cross over into serotonin syndrome. So not just what medications you're on, but what supplements you're taking. And then a bit about your personal, spiritual, and mental history, trauma history as part of that intake as well. Because there are times where ayahuasca is better collaborated with than others. And sometimes people come thinking that it's a panacea. But if you are addressing trauma and you don't have any trauma support back at home, you haven't talked to a therapist about this, you don't have a container to land in after working with ayahuasca, it might not be the right time. It might be time to like get some tools with local people and then integrate ayahuasca into those tools. So those are all the things that we're looking at with people that I think, not just I think, that I know actually that other centers are not fully investigating to make sure that it's not only the right medicine, but it's being used at the right time in somebody's life.
are there any diagnoses or or practices that would be contraindicated for someone who is thinking about partaking of ayahuasca or other plant medicines? I
Yeah,
think
well,
I
ayahuasca specifically is it's contraindicated with anybody that has a history of schizophrenia or psychosis. Um, Now, there are research centers looking at how psychedelics might be integrated into working through schizophrenia or through psychosis. And I love the movie. I'm like blanking on the name, but there's this documentary that talks about psychosis, how it was viewed in communities in the past, and how people with psychosis were actually commonly then put into the position of healer and shaman and seer in their communities. And we do have a skewed view of psychosis in Western medicine, I believe. There are centers that are working through this and kind of finding out what the boundaries are. But these are medical centers that are closely monitoring people, have antipsychotics on hand in case a line gets crossed, and are monitoring, heart rate, respiratory rate, all kinds of different things. So right now, that is a limitation. Like that needs to be done in a research setting with skilled clinicians that know when to intervene with medications and when to let people have a breakthrough. But yeah, those are the strict contraindications. But if you have some of these conditions, or if you're on SSRIs and curious about addressing the trauma side of your inflammation, this is where ketamine clinics can come in handy. And I think of
Mhm.
ketamine clinics as like a first step towards ayahuasca for people who are on antidepressives, anti-anxiety medications, and still wanting to address this layer of themselves.
That's a really good suggestion, especially here in Colorado. Ketamine, I think, is legal now and
Hmm.
is being used in medical clinics and medical surroundings, things like that, for specifically for trauma therapy. And I think it's having a lot of effects, which is amazing because, as we know, when people have deep trauma, it's very, very difficult to get through that. And that's
Yeah.
why it internalizes and comes out as these chronic illnesses
Yeah.
often.
Yeah, and with ketamine in particular, I would encourage people to work with a ketamine clinic where they're doing ketamine assisted psychotherapy, because we know that it can also be an addictive substance when used outside of certain clinical contexts. And I think that's a risk worth noting. What's interesting about like ayahuasca is that when you're taking ayahuasca as the brood vine and leaves the vine of ayahuasca and the leaves of chacruna, it actually has a inverse relationship to addiction. So like the more often you drink it, the more adverse you become to it. And they've shown in studies that it's not an addictive psychedelic. So that is a key difference between working with ketamine and working with ayahuasca, is this propensity towards addiction. But people who are really working with it intentionally around ketamine assisted psychotherapy, it doesn't go tend to go down those addiction routes and can actually be used to help people with addictive personalities. Anyways, informed consent is so important.
All of that is such good information for anybody who is considering doing ayahuasca. I, this question just popped into my mind. It wasn't one I was planning to ask earlier, but here in the Southwest, the traditional indigenous psychedelic is peyote. Do
Mhm.
you work at all with peyote at your center? Is that even common in Latin America?
So peyote does not grow here in South America. It does have that distribution of the southern United States and northern Mexico. And I haven't sat with peyote. I am curious about it, but I um, haven't ever experienced it. I'm not somebody who got into this as like what they call a psychonaut. I'm not somebody who got into this like having a past history of doing a bunch of mushrooms in college or LSD, or I'm not like never done MDMA. Like there's so many psychedelics that have not ever entered my body. And yeah, so I didn't get into this like seeking out some of these peak experiences that people do when hopping from psychedelic to psychedelic. I really got into this w observing the physical, mental, emotional, spiritual healing that people had with one single cup of a brewed herbal medicine. And I saw in a ceremony one time my wall of herbs. When I had my clinic in Arizona, I had a wall of like 150 plus herbs. And the medicine, like the vision I had was like, have you ever created a tincture this effective for Parkinson's, inflammation, cancer, Lyme's, like just like listing all the things. And I'm like, no, I've never made the perfect tincture that addressed all of these things. And that's really how I followed ayahuasca and the calling here to Peru. So I haven't sat with peyote, but we do have another type of cactus here that's similar to peyote called wachuma or San Pedro. And actually, we're hosting a wachuma retreat here right now. So we do work with a cactus, but it's different than peyote.
So a retreat would only contain one type of plant medicine at a time?
It depends. It depends on how long somebody is here with us, and it's and when the sequence of things, because it can be dangerous to combine different psychedelics. And then there's ways where different psychedelics can be collaborative. Like, for example, Bufo is pretty common, or like pretty popular, I think, in the United States right now. It's also called 5-MeO DMT. And it's naturally sourced from a Sonoran desert toad that's endangered, so don't recommend putting endangered animals at risk for psychedelic use. And then there's a chemical synthesis of it called 5-MeO DMT. And the only time that ayahuasca has had any fatalities is when it's been combined with bufo. Outside of
Mm.
that, centuries of documentation, or at least 100 years of documenting use of ayahuasca, and there's never been any fatalities when ayahuasca is used by itself. So we have to approach combining these things with caution. Um, but Wachuma and ayahuasca, if what can happen is people will take Wachuma before ayahuasca, which is a more dangerous drug interaction for those two plants, because Wachuma, like peyote, has a very long half-life and can last for 17 hours in people. And so if you don't give yourself a full 48 to 72 hours before drinking ayahuasca, it can cause a negative interaction. However, ayahuasca has a short half-life in the body, and its half-life is more like 3 hours. And so you can often take Wachuma 24 hours after the end of an ayahuasca ceremony. So it just like some of this is just knowing. Now I'm getting nerdy about like pharmacokinetics. So sorry if this is boring. But it's about the point is you have to know the medicines and how they're working in the body.
Which made me think or want to ask, are there any negative effects from people that people could experience by coming down and partaking of plant medicine?
The side effect profile is usually more like within ceremony. So people often know of ayahuasca as a purgative. That's actually their biggest fear is vomiting, or I heard somebody poop their pants. Okay, yes, these things can happen, but not often. Like in my hundreds of ceremonies, I think I've like one time one person did that. So there's been thousands of people who have come through that did not do that. So that is an effect that happens just in the container of ceremony. You're generally not having side effects of nausea, vomiting, diarrhea outside of the ceremony. And the other side effects can be, and this is where integration is really important, is that people can actually have like a residual euphoria from doing plant medicines. Right. And this is great. Like, we want euphoria. We want to be happy. We want to love everybody. We want to love our lives. And this can happen with psilocybin, with mushrooms as well. And this residual euphoria feels great, but it's important to be aware of. And it's one of the reasons why we tell people not to make any major life-changing decisions 30 days after a retreat, because we want that euphoria to kind of slowly wean off and make sure you're making life-changing decisions from a very grounded place. And like I said, this is where integration comes in as well, to make sure that we're taking some of the lessons that come through ceremony and actually implementing them into our day-to-day lives, and in a really um, physical way, in a really grounded way, in a way that's making small changes over time versus grandiose gestures. As we know, small changes over time compound. Grandiose gestures tend to, at some point or another, totally implode. So you've probably experienced this in your life in other ways. Like, it's easier to wean off foods over time sometimes than like go on a super strict diet all at once, and you can only maintain it for 2 weeks instead of the rest of your life. So
Such a good point. Is there anything else you would like to tell people who are listening about plant medicine, and especially as it relates to chronic inflammation?
yeah, I think with chronic inflammation, I'll just highlight something that I've been seeing over and over again, but I just want it all to land really clearly in your body when you're listening to this, that there are pieces of you that are being called to be listened to be seen, to be acknowledged, whether that's a spiritual part of you, a emotional part of you, a trauma that's been walled off. That is really a key part of the inflammatory cascade. And maybe plant medicine is the right next step for you. Maybe it's not. These things can really be looked at through breath work, through art as therapy, through hiking and moving, meditation. And there's all kinds of ways to reach these places within yourself. And I think that community and having community is a missing piece in medicine for addressing chronic inflammation and chronic inflammatory diseases. And having to heal in isolation is its own inflammatory cascade. So, if you take nothing else from this conversation and you're like, oh my gosh, ayahuasca sounds scary, that sounds crazy, at least look into something that can help address these places within you that want to be heard, and connect with community.
I recently saw a stat that said that if you age with a community, it brings you, I think it's 7 more years of life than you would have had if you were alone. So I think you're absolutely right about that. that emphasis on community. I think that can make all the difference in many people's lives.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. And one more thing that we
Yeah,
do have the ceremonial prescription is one of the downloads I provided to you for this episode. And it talks about the science behind ceremony and non-psychedelic ways we can integrate ceremony and community into our life in the morning, at night, throughout our day. So ceremony itself has healing aspects to it, all the ones that we've talked about here. And it doesn't take a trip to Peru and it doesn't take a psychedelic to get there.
such great information. Heather, how can people reach you? How can they find you?
Yes, so you can find me a couple of different places. You can find us at our website, hampoi.com. That's spelled Hampuy.com. And Hampoi is a Quechua word, so it's a weird word. It's Quechua, and Quechua is the language spoken here in the Andes Mountains, which means to come. It's an invitation. Come, come. And we use that word to invite in spirits, apus, and angelic beings into ceremony. That's how they call them to the space, is by saying Hampoi. So we invite you to come. Also, I've been having some fun on Substack lately. You can find me on Substack at Dr. Heather Paulson, and you can also find me on Instagram at Dr. Heather Paulson. And I would love to connect with you.
Fantastic. Heather, thank you so much for this conversation today. I think it was fascinating. I learned a lot. I hope our listeners learned a lot. I'm sure they did, because this is not information you're going to hear in your doctor's office, for example. So,
No, it's actually illegal for your doctor to talk about it, which is why I had to move to Peru.
that makes sense, because you're not paying a pharmaceutical company for the privilege of partaking in ayahuasca and um, enjoying all the benefits of plant medicine. Thank you, Heather. This was such a pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that's another case filed on the Inflammation Investigator. Remember, every symptom is your body's way of communicating. We just need to learn the language. If today's episode sparked something for you, I want to hear about it. Share your own investigation discoveries with me on social media at Elizabeth Yarnell, or find me at elizabethyarnell.com. Your experience could be exactly what another listener needs to hear. And make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. And here's the thing about investigations: they work best when you're not going it alone. If this podcast is helping you uncover the answers you've been searching for, please like, rate, subscribe, and review, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. As a new podcast, these actions mean more than you know. Want to dive deeper into your own inflammation investigation? Head over to inflammationinvestigator.com, where you can take my free inflammation quiz to uncover which hidden triggers might be affecting your health. Until next time, this is Elizabeth Yarnell, your inflammation investigator, reminding you that the solutions to your health issues are out there. Let's find them together.